Now, as you know, you can take paint straight out of the tube and build it up for thick textures, but it'll take forever to dry. So what these exercises will do is suggest ways of pre-texturing, which means applying a layer of paint that dries sooner, faster, first as an underlayer, and then lightly glazing over that to give relief or definition to that texture. There's a couple ways of doing it. And let's start with one that I call modeling paste pre-texturing. Most objects are either smooth or bumpy. This is a Christmas ball ornament painted gray, and this is a piece of coal painted gray. And I'm going to switch on a light here to increase the raking light on here. And I want to be able to capture both of these kinds of textures. Okay, I'm going to draw two circles. And then two irregular shapes. We want to show one of these shapes. The top one can be smooth, and the bottom one can be jagged and rough. First, before putting the texturing, the modeling paste down, I want to cover the whole surface to make sure we are sealed up with acrylic matte medium. It's not thinned down with water, it's just straight out of the thing. And here's this modeling paste. It's kind of thick like toothpaste or so. It doesn't want to stick. Oh, there we go. Okay, now it's sticking, and while it's still liquid, I can smush it around. It's like a pasty material. The texture doesn't have to fit inside the contour lines at all. You can be really loose with this. You can think of the pre-texturing as almost like a bas-relief version of the texture you're doing. Since most paintings are lit from above, the planes of the texture that are facing toward the light will be slightly lighter. So even if you paint white on the surface of the painting, the white will be a brighter white if it's in this impasto area. Now that modeling paste will be dry after a couple hours. The modeling paste on its own is quite matte and absorbent, so if you thin down the black paint with mineral spirits alone, it'll soak in almost like water into an absorbent background. But what it will do too is it'll settle down into the pits of the texture, and that's what I'm going for. Now I can use a little white in there to paint the second ball and make it a little bit more smooth surfaced. And to do that, I'm not going to have any underpainting texture, and I'm going to make the transitions a little more gradual using a bristle brush. With oil, it's pretty easy to get these soft transitions. A little harder to do in water media because it dries so fast. Now using a rag with a little mineral spirits in it, after it dries I can lift off that layer of black and get down to the color of the texturing, or I could even go in with dragging a light stroke of lighter values on the light side. So this looks kind of like the moon or something, a rough surfaced planetoid, but you get the idea of how you can get something that's got a lot of texture using a pre-textured underpainting surface. All the oil painting I'm applying to this is really very thin and it'll dry fast. So it looks like thick paint, but it's really not. Now this jagged sort of planetoid, I've put all kinds of random pre-texturing, and I'm scrubbing a gray tone over the whole thing. Now a darker tone to suggest some shadows. And the fun thing about this is that the texture doesn't have to match up exactly with the specific forms. If there's a mismatch, it'll still look natural when you shoot this way down, or if this is a small detail of the final painting. The whole idea with these little exercises, of course, is to try things out and experiment. And it's fun to binge watch something and watch someone else paint, but this is something you can try yourself. Take these materials, combine them in various ways, and see if you can suggest certain textures using unusual combinations, especially if it doesn't involve laborious and deliberate painting with a brush. Now I'm going to try the same thing, except to soften the edges. Now I'm going to try to get more or less the same forms, but as if you sanded everything off and rounded it off. I think this is a good exercise to do in general too when you're trying out painting and practicing, is to paint something in a hyper-realistic, detailed focus in one area of your picture, and then paint maybe the background areas as if everything is thrown out of focus. And to have some areas, some forms that are sharp and detailed, and other forms that are soft and rounded, just to get contrast in the picture. It's a natural tendency for us to want to paint everything in sharp focus because of the way our eyes and our brains focus on objects all throughout the scene we're looking at and give us the impression that everything is tight and detailed. But at any given moment, to the human eye and to the camera, there's a lot of sharpness balanced off against a lot of softness. And I find getting soft edges takes a little bit more conscious effort than getting sharp details. And what you definitely don't want is to have equal amounts of detail or equal size brush strokes all through the picture. That immediately flags the picture as being fake or painted or artificial. All right, let's go back now to the T.rex paintings and put this into action. Okay, so before we started our experiments with pre-texturing, we had finished the pencil drawing and are ready to cover that with matte medium and some of that modeling compound. Again, the first step would be to cover the whole surface with a big house painter's brush. If I miss an area and don't cover it evenly, the oil will soak in at a different rate and will be a different value, so you get a patch of darker tone. That's why I'm being careful to cover the whole surface with at least a thin layer of the matte medium. Now I'm dipping in to the modeling paste, and because I know this is going to be backlit, there's going to be a lot of interesting texture along the top edge. And that's the place where you get the most interesting texture, is right at the dividing line between light and shadow. The shadow itself doesn't have much texture in it. It's up here on the terminator line. So I think about that while I'm placing the modeling paste, trying to get it where that light turns into shadow. Let me skip ahead to the final painting so you can see how that texture plays out. I'm using the palette knife to drag strokes across that texture, and it sets me up for all kinds of interesting accidental feathers catching light. And let's look at the final dried painting so you can kind of see how some of that texture there is individual strokes laid down with the palette knife or the brush, and some of it is pre-texturing that I put in advance. But most of it is up there where that light turns into shadow. Let's skip ahead to the third painting. This is a forest scene where a Tyrannosaurus is attacking an Edmontosaurus. Now there'll be a fair amount of texture where the light is coming from the right on the side of the Tyrannosaur. And I also want to get some random textures up in the foliage of the trees. So I dip the house painter's brush right into that modeling paste. Normally when a painting is shot, it's lit by copy lights coming from both the right and the left equally, which tends to flatten out texture. So that's one of the reasons we build it up in the underpainting and then glaze into it to accentuate it. And on the ground there'll be some rough texture too, so let's put some down there. Some people go for an overall texture in the whole painting, and you could do that too, but I like to keep the sky fairly smooth. Now skipping ahead, you can see how I can drag the brush strokes over the top of the texture to pick up some randomness that I might not have gotten by deliberate painting. If I need to get a stroke to go down through those mountains and valleys, I can make it a little bit more full of medium. There we are, dragging it over the top. In this case, instead of sinking into the valleys, it's floating on the mountaintops. If I want to remove some of it with a rag, I can do that also, just to lighten it up a little bit. The way to really see what this texture is doing is to put it in directional light. This is outdoors in sunlight shining from one direction, so you can really see how much that's sticking up. Okay, now let's move on to the second major kind of texture, is using oil paint for the pre-texturing rather than modeling paste. Now I have this piece of absorbent cardstock or blotter paper to remove the oil from the white oil paint. By squeezing it out on this absorbent cardboard, the oil will soak down, and I can also make it dry faster by using cobalt dryer in the white. Not much, just a tiny drop. Oh, little studio tip, you can use the lid from a water bottle instead of those child-proof tops. Okay, so just a drop of that cobalt dryer mixed into the white. We've got some smooth black cardboard, sealed with acrylic matte medium. I'm going to use a Prismacolor regular colored pencil and draw the boundaries of, let's say, a tree trunk, a segmented, primitive, kind of like a tree fern. And with this, what I want to do is build up the surface with white, the white mixed with the cobalt dryer. And I can very freely add texture to this surface. First, let's cover the area with a smear of paint. Okay, now I want to have the light will be coming from the right-hand side. So I'll build up the thickness of the paint on the right-hand side. It's all white here, of course. Where we're going to get the texture is from the glazes we put over it. And just like water runs down a mountainside, the glaze will run down the slopes that I make here, the little mountains that I make in the pre-textured surface. If I didn't drain out some of the oil and use some of the cobalt dryer, this would take a very long time to dry. We want it to dry overnight if possible. You can accelerate the drying of oil a little bit by putting it under a warm incandescent light bulb. Some people have made little ovens to put their paintings in, but you got to be careful you don't get the painting too warm. Okay, now that that's dried, I'm going to take this thinned down oil, and this oil is thinned with both liquid and a little bit of mineral spirits. And you can see how that floats right down into the hollows. It has to be fairly thin, the black, in order to go down. Okay, now let's go do this on the painting. I've mixed up that white with the cobalt dryer, and I'm laying it down on the tree. Because I want this tree to come forward as if it's catching a lot of light with a lot of texture, but I want it to be random. I don't want to make it too deliberately painted. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of gray, but still thick paint, and put it on the shadow side so that I'll automatically have a slightly darker value for the shadow side of this tree. Doesn't have to be pure white. So I've allowed that to dry, so it's very dry now, and I'm dropping in with a bristle brush some of that shadow value. And now that tree trunk sort of pops forward. So once again, here's the final oil painting in raking light, so you can really see that texture. And in normal light, the texture is not as noticeable, but it's still there. This has been an excerpt from a longer oil painting tutorial called Unconventional Oil Techniques. And in the full video, I'll take you through the painting of all three of these dinosaur paintings, from start to finish, including the sketches. And I'll also take you through each of these 11 painting tutorials that demonstrate the unusual techniques that I use for various painting assignments. If you want to see another sample from the series, check on this link here or click on this one here. Don't forget to subscribe down here. And down in the description, I've got lots of links to materials, download tutorials, and DVDs. Thanks for watching, and remember the spirit of invention and experimentation. That's the key to learning to paint.